All right, gang, Professor McElroy here, advertising design. We're going to dive into Learning Module 2. Learning Module 1, we kind of got into Photoshop, learned a little bit about layers, about pixels, about kind of the layer styles, layer effects, a couple of just basic features of raster-based or pixel-based design. We did some collaging of elements, duplicating layers, doing different effects, opacities, different things with images, just so that you could see how it worked. We erased a little bit, some edges of images. We navigated into a few of the key tools, kind of the key terminology, key processes for using Photoshop. A lot of your chapters, as you start to kind of go forward, get into some more selection and masking environments where we start to really start to enhance parts of the pictures, do different things as we image collage to kind of get that surreal environment going. So today I want to spend a lot of time just emphasizing some different techniques for selection and masking, object selecting, how to layer object masks, and how to then manipulate those elements both individually and import it into a new layer environment so that you can see kind of how objects interact. This will push us into really a higher level of professionalism as it relates to putting a raster-based advertising solution together, a photo-based advertising solution together, where it feels more seamless, feels a little bit better. Next week, we'll get into perspective and some different angles and transforming objects and things like that. But today, we're just going to focus a little bit on object selection, of which Photoshop has gotten way better at. What I used to do by hand that took me quite a long time, you can do in an algorithm environment where Photoshop can figure it out for you. So we're going to dive into Photoshop and start playing around with some images. Your chapters, as you kind of get into 3, 4, 5, start to be doing lighting, some enhanced textures, some just different perspective kind of things. So I just want to walk you through my thought process when I'm doing object blending, object manipulation, kind of layer importing, and how it works, why it's important, why certain things should be done certain ways, how to preserve pixel density as we're kind of doing the things we want to do, just in case we have to go back to some of those original elements or hidden elements in our design as we kind of import different things. The key is in Photoshop, just like any program, that if you can build an environment where things are interchangeable, if you ever have to interchange parts, you can rather easily. I saw a post, it was an article or something, and it was an artist, and he showed like 3 different designs of the exact same thing, and all he did was change the state imagery inside each of the layered Photoshop files, and it was the exact same image, just replaced for each state he was designing for. So if we can kind of create this masking object selecting environment, we can replace pieces very easily and replicate our design over and over and over again. And that's kind of what the concept behind campaigning is, what they call campaigning. And that's when advertisers, designers create a message and they consistently apply it across multiple applications. And they also replace parts, but keep the message the same so that the viewer thinks they've already seen the design before, but in actuality, they saw a different interpretation of the design, but all the objects are scaled, placed, manipulated, put in the same place. We just replace the parts, same effects, different parts. And so that's kind of the concept here, is that we kind of preserve our pixels, preserve our layers, but then manipulate in the environment so that we can swap things in and out. So, all right, so that brings us over to Photoshop, but we got to grab a few images first so we can take a look at this process, how it works, how we can clean it up, different things like that. So let's go out and grab some pictures. You know that we need to get some high quality ones. So we'll just go to Pexels like we always do. And I want to grab a few different objects, a few different things to look at. So the very first image, let's do waterfalls. So we're just going to go out and grab a picture of waterfalls, and then we're going to do rocks, and then we'll do like a hiker and maybe an iguana or something like that, so we can kind of bring all these elements together. So we need to find a decent picture of some waterfalls. Man, there's some great ones here. Just for the sake of the process, I'm trying to look for portrait, not landscape, just so that you can kind of see how we can kind of put everything in, which would be a little bit more consistent with some kind of advertising format. whether it's a web banner that goes on the right-hand side or an advertisement that goes into a e-magazine or something like that. So I'm just going to grab this one. So this picture right here is a nice one. So just try to pick something that's portrait, not landscape. So try not to pick one of these elongated ones. Try to pick one that's a little bit more vertical instead of horizontal. So I'm going to click on this one. I'm going to download it. I'm going to drag it over to my desktop just so that we have that basic image there. So there it is. I'm going to go in now and I'm going to look for rocks. So let's just find waterfalls. Let's find rocks. And I want to find an image that's a little bit more like a boulder. So I want something like this because we're going to select just this boulder as a mask. We're going to bring it in and manipulate it and do all those good things to it. So let's go ahead and download our rock next. I'm going to drop that over there. I'm actually going to rename my images just so that when I'm looking for them on the desktop, it's not all starting with the name Pexels. So I'm just going to do that. And then I'm going to do waterfall. Okay, so I have rocks and waterfalls. I need a hiker, some kind of hiker or something. So let's do hiker. See if we can find someone. Different kinds of hikers here. This guy right here is kind of cool. Kind of has that beautiful sky because we're actually going to cut him out and we're going to blur and blend his backpack in. So let's just do a basic hiker here. So we've got rocks, we've got waterfalls. We're going to use waterfall as our foundation. And then we're going to bring in our hiker, our rock, and we're going to bring in an iguana. So let's name this hiker. So you should have rocks image, waterfall image, hiker image, and then last but not least, let's do an iguana. You ever see those iguanas down in Naples and stuff? They're like wandering around the streets and stuff now. Somebody brought a couple of iguanas from somewhere. They must have released them down there and they mated, and now there's like iguanas all over the place down in Naples. It's like ridiculous. Okay, so I'm going to take this little guy right here. So I'm just going to grab this guy because I'm going to put him on the rock and I'm going to put the hiker by the waterfall. And we're just going to do some composition blending, some just basic composition blending. So this guy's pretty much almost whole. I see there's a finger cut off and a little bit of his tail, but we'll be able to play with that. So let's go ahead and download Mr. Iguana. Drag that over. I'm going to rename the file to iguana just so that I have it. And once I have those 4 images, I'm golden. That's like going to be the beginning of my process here. Keep in mind, I'm using the waterfall as my background or my foundation layer. I'm going to bring in the hiker and the rock and iguana just to kind of show you ways to blend things together. We're going to do some feathering edges. We're going to do refine edges. We're just going to blend a few things in. So waterfall, iguana, hiker, and rock. All right, so we're going to bring the waterfall image in first into Photoshop because this is going to be our foundational element, right? So we're going to import that in. I'm going to take it to look at the image size, see the quality of this image. It's enormous, 55 inches by 83 inches at 72 DPI. So if I was to change this to 300 DPI, I mean, we're talking about a really, really big image. So if I change this to, I don't know, 12 by 300, I mean, we're still talking about 55 megs. So just know it was 68 to start with, and now it's 55. So that's really crazy. This is a really high quality picture, but that's great because we've got to put our rock, we got to do our iguana. There's a bunch of things we have to do to it. Now, remember, if this is our background image and we're going to be building upon this image, the first thing I want to do is I want to release this background layer, right? So I'm going to bring that in and I'm just going to name it waterfall. And just remember, all that does is it gives us access to transparency, right? Because there's nothing behind it, nothing underneath it, which means it does not have to be the bottom layer if we don't want it to be the bottom layer. We could absolutely add a new layer, make that layer black, put the waterfall on top of it and change the opacity, and we'll get kind of this halo effect going. So just for the sake of the process, let's do that. So let's add a new layer. So we're going to add a new layer. We're going to do a select all, which is Command A. And we're going to do edit fill. And we're going to fill the color in black. Right? And so I always like to deselect the ants when I get done. So you see select, deselect, or Command D. So there aren't marching ants around that thing. There's nothing selected. Now watch what happens. Let's click and drag this layer underneath. Right? So the waterfall is there above it. And let's change the opacity of the waterfall down to like 80%. So you can see that once you release that layer, you can make your canvas anything you want it to be. And that's how you get kind of this effect of kind of haloing in an image and stuff like that, is that they use the background layer, they make it black, they release the photo, they put that on top, and then they create this kind of muted or washed out version of the image. We're going to leave that like that for now, but we'll go back and manipulate it a little bit later. Now, I want to go, and the first thing we want to do is let's open up the iguana. So let's go to the iguana and let's open him up in Photoshop. So I'm just going to drag him down to the corner so that he opens up in Photoshop. So here he is, Mr. Iguana. You can do file open, you can grab the little image and drag it down to the PS, just depending on what format you're using, what computer you're using, Android, iMac, whatever. We're going to go ahead and release this one, and we're going to name him Iguana. And we're going to start masking these objects so that we can bring them all into the waterfall, and then we can do what we truly have to do to get this thing. But let's take a look at the image size, just so we know what we're dealing with, right? This one's even bigger, 72 inches wide by a resolution of 72. And that was under image size. I was just checking resolution so I can see what's going on with the image as it relates to the pixel density of the other image, right? We want to make sure that we're bringing high quality images in so that when we import the layers in, it doesn't come in really small on something that's really big. This is actually going to come in as big as the waterfall, which is crazy, but that means he could be up really close to the camera and the waterfall could be way in the background. So we want to make sure resolution matches so that the quality of the image we bring in is the same as the quality of the image that is the background image, because everything resets to the resolution of the background image when you import layers in. So if you bring in layers from other files, it always defaults to the format, resolution, color mode of the image as the background image. So we just want to make sure that we're playing in the same resolution, which we are. Okay, so we talked about in week 1 using things like the lasso tool, the polygon lasso, the magnetic lasso, and we were trying to select those little pixels, right? And we talked about how if it's on a solid background, things like the magic wand tool becomes a little bit easier because you can click in the image and sample some of the objects pixels that are in the background, right? You can do some basic selecting. But we want to do is we want to get this thing and bring it over so that we can manipulate it in the waterfall environment. So let's go in and let's duplicate this layer, and we're going to bring it into our waterfall layer. So let's just duplicate the layer, bring it into the waterfall layer. And you're going to notice that this thing is really big, right? So here it is. It has the name, same name. Let's check our image mode, make sure everything is okay. And so now we have this big lizard here, iguana, and he's over top of the waterfall. So we talked about the lasso tool. We talked about the quick select tool, magic wand tool, where we could click on pixels, right? And try to select, like if we hold down shift, and try to select all these white areas. We could do select inverse and try to grab the iguana. That's what we did last week. We tried to use selection tools. We talked a little bit about like the magnetic lasso, where you can kind of follow around the edge of the lizard and try to figure out how to select this guy, the iguana. But there's actually a better way. This is a newer, better practice way that Photoshop has come up with versus just manually selecting. When I originally would select an object back in the day, I would actually use my pen tool and take my pen tool and go all the way around the shape using the pen tool. And I'm just going to make it short so you can see. I would go all the way around the shape, and then I would click on it and I would say make selection, and it would select the object for me. So I would use the pen tool just like I did in Illustrator, and I would trace all the way around this object the very best I could using the pen tool, and then I would make a selection out of that. But when you select any of these selection tools, you're actually going to see that there's a thing called select and mask that appears up here in the corner. Select and mask. So as long as you're on the layer that you want to manipulate, so don't fall in love with this stuff behind it, because we're not dealing with stuff behind it. We're only dealing with the iguana layer. We can go to select and mask. So let's click on that button so we can take a look at what this thing does. Now, you're going to notice a couple of things. One thing is that this image has some level of transparency. Traditionally, the default is like around 20%. So you can kind of see him, but then you can see a little bit of the checkerboard behind it. So it has a high quality preview set up, and it's got us set to, in essence, zeros across the board. 0 radius for our brush, zero feathering, smoothing, contrast, edge selection, any of that. All that stuff is set to 0. But you're going to notice right up here is a couple of things we got to know. So here are our selection tools inside of our select and mask, and we have a couple of little things going on right up here. One is add to the selection, and one is remove or subtract from selection. So just the same way as we did shift to add and option to remove when we use the lasso tool, you can do it in the select object area. But you also notice that the algorithm for Photoshop has gotten really good, where it's actually giving you the option of trying to select the object in the image. So let's go ahead and give that a shot. Now, everywhere that is bright color is selected. So if I crank down my opacity a little bit, you're going to really see it. So he's almost perfectly selected. I could see some of his tail maybe isn't. So when I crank this up, so you can see part of his tail isn't, right? Because I changed the transparency of it. Some of his tail isn't, some of his arm isn't, but it did a really good first shot at it. So watch if I take my cursor now and I just click on his tail a little bit. It will actually try to pick the pixels of that object inside the tail and add it to the selection. So you can see his arm right down here. I'm just going to click my mouse and hold it down and swipe diagonally through the middle of his arm down here. So watch what happens. The minute I clicked on it, it selects it. It selects 0 radius, which means it just tries to find the range of color. It has no fuzzy edges, like when we erased with part of the object last week. It actually does a really good job of selecting. But you'll notice right here, part of his finger is selected, but it's actually not part of his finger. It's part of the background. So watch if I go to minus instead of plus, and I tap my mouse in there. It removes the selection, right? So I'm going to zoom in. So Command plus, I'm going to zoom in a little bit. I'm going to use my space bar to turn this into a hand, right? So it's a hand, and I'm going to pinch down. Now you see in between all of the little space in his hair, quotation mark hair, it's selected. See this little white shape right there? It's selected. There's no checkerboard there. We need to remove all of the little white areas in between his fingers, his hair, by using the minus tool and just tapping our mouse in essence. So watch when I just tap my mouse in there and just draw a little line. See how that's a checkerboard right now? If I tap my mouse and just draw a little line in between there, it's now transparent. It's hard to tell because the checkerboard is so small. So if you zoom in a little bit more, Command plus, you're gonna see that when I tap my mouse in there, it makes that checkerboard. So if I squiggle it a little bit, just draw a line, it actually will clean it up. So I'm just clicking and dragging my mouse a little bit. I need to remove all of the areas of the image that aren't actually the iguana, they're part of the background. Now, this is quickly should push your brain forward to think photos of models with wispy hair and all the space between their wispy hair. That's done by this technique, including a feathering. Feathering means that it blurs the edge of an object. So if I change feathering to 10 point and I only mask the head of the model and I put it as a layer on top of the model as a whole photo, I can feather only the hair on the head and not feather any other part of the body. And so when you see close-ups for makeup and everything, and their hair is all like this, all they did was feather, select, and mask the head of the model and blend all the hair into the background. So we'll see how that works in a minute. But let's go around our iguana and let's remove any areas of the image that is not part of the iguana in the selection. So what is selected is what's bright colored pixels. What isn't selected should be checkerboard. So anywhere in the image you see that doesn't look just right. And I'm just going to follow the edge of this guy a little bit. And I'm just going to tap my mouse, because if I click and drag my mouse, it's actually going to remove sometimes more than I want it to move. So you can do Command Z if you want to undo one of your steps, like if you blend too much. You can also switch back to plus and go through the process. But you'll notice under his fingers, all of this should be transparent. So this right here should be transparent. And so I'm going to go around and try to clean up this guy. And you'll be amazed at how seamless he looks. He has these shadows on his fingers. I don't want the shadows on the fingers because I want to remove the shadows on the fingers because and you can change the size of the brush right up here, which is what I'm doing, just so that when I tap my mouse, it's only removing the parts that I want to remove. It's tricky when the color is close because it thinks you're grabbing part of the nail in some instances. But this process right here of selecting the object and removing elements of the object is way easier in object select mode than it ever was when I first started in design, because I would have to manually clone out, manually feather, manually select any part of the object that I did not want. And this has made life a lot easier from a blending standpoint. So your hand should look something like that, where we really have kind of gotten rid of the shadowing under it. That is a small area in the image. So you'll actually notice sometimes if you look in advertising that it's not perfect. But I want to remove the shadowing. Let me go back to add. I got to bring his finger back. Sometimes it's better to just let it take it away and then put it back a little bit easier. So like this shadow here. It comes down to color separation with the pixels. If the part of the finger is close to color of the shadow, it can get a little tricky. So I see on his back, there's a little bit of hair spikes back here that got taken out. So I've got to fill them back in a little bit. They must have been part of my selection process. Let me just make sure that I don't lose those. And I like to work in a transparency environment that is a little bit higher. So it really removes the background so I can truly see what has been removed and what has been selected. And you're going to see what happens when we create this thing. So see how you can do. We should have an iguana that basically has some hair here. He's pretty clean. Keep in mind, he's really huge. So when we scale him down, which I won't do until I completely manipulate this guy and layer stack this guy, more than likely. But now, if we did not do select object, select subject, we would have used our brush, our add brush, and touched each area of the iguana, and it would have turned bright colors. The thing with the select subject or select object is that it started with an already a base of what it thought the object was. And the algorithm is pretty good. Even if this was a complicated picture, it would find the primary object and try to select that subject no matter how busy the thing was. So it is pretty good about that. All right, are we okay? Do we have kind of the iguana selected okay? Like basically? All right, so we're going to leave it exactly the way it was 0 everything. And we're just going to say, okay. And now you're going to see this thing. This is a selection mask. So the background of the iguana still exists, but you only see what is white in that little thumbnail there. So imagine black is hidden, white is foreground in essence. And actually it's the same concept of the black and white swatches of background and foreground. And an interesting part is we can always go back in there and add and subtract from our selection, but we didn't destroy any of the pixels that exist around. We didn't delete any pixels. We just hid the pixels around the iguana. So what's white in the mask is visible. What's black in this little thumbnail mask is in essence hidden. So the white is a picture window, the black is hidden. Does that make sense? Okay. You didn't? So let's select the mask. So let's start here. All right, let's visual effect. I like my phone. Oh, okay, yeah, okay, there you go. Yeah, but it should automatically just generate a layer. Because you select, yeah, I mean, if you click on that, it will give you a layer. And it will give you what I have, but what I'm trying to figure out is why it did not populate. All it did was load a selection. So let's double check
I
something.
still have my pants go around.
I know, that's because it didn't mask it. So that's the interesting part. So I'm going to double click on mine so I can get back into it. So why is your view? Radius, output settings, output to a layer mask. So maybe your output settings.
It's not, it's a lot.
Yeah, change it to layer mask. So someone went in and put it, I'm actually going to show you why selection is important, but it should be a mask just as a default because it allows us to keep those that are valid. All someone did was change it to selection so that they could cut out the background, which is what we did last week. We selected something and then we removed the background from the selection. In essence, that's what someone on that computer did, but it's actually not the best practice. The best practice is to have a layer mask, and I'll show you. So now that we both have the layer mask, know that you can always go back in, right? So if I double click on that, I can go back in and make adjustments because the pixels are still there. I didn't remove anything. The pixels are still there. The other important thing is you can go in here and you can disable the layer mask and all the pixels are still there, but it still has the mask. So if you ever needed to see the raw data that existed in the original image, it's there. It's like just a picture window that we created in order to create this. So instead of having to have an original layer, it's all stored in the mask, which is a much better practice because now we have the iguana selected. Now, something about that process on your computer that was correct was that we should save our selection because we took the time to select the iguana. Why we save the selection? We save the selection because that silhouette shape might be something we want down the road, underneath, on top of, create that silhouette out of another photo. I mean, having that outline is a good thing to have. It's kind of like when you do a pencil drawing or a pen drawing in Illustrator. Even if you end up not having a stroke around your object, it's good to have the shape because you can always clip something out of it. It's just good to have. So if you right click over here, you're going to see all kinds of, we can disable it. We can create a clipping mask of some basic blending options. But if we actually right click on the black thumbnail for the mask, I like to do add mask to selection. So let's do add mask to selection. And you're going to notice it looks exactly like what it was if we just masked it and chose selection instead of layer mask. I need this shape, or at least I want this shape. So now that it has the marching ants going around on it, our selection, we actually took, in essence, we took our magic wand and tapped in the white shape of there to get that selection. It's only the silhouette. What I like to do as a best practice is I like to go up to select and I like to do save selection. So select, save selection. Now, the reason we save the selection, and we're actually going to name this iguana, is so that, and I'm going to show you, there are things like in your book, it has the model with the glow going around the head. Well, the head is a silhouette filled in white with a blur and a glow applied to it so that it halos the person. The easiest way to halo a person is to use a cutout of the person and apply attributes to the cutout instead of the image itself. Another reason that's important is we're going to end up feathering parts of objects, which means erasing part of the pixels. So imagine the pixels is like a woven blanket. And if we just punch holes in parts of the woven blanket so you can see light through, feathering in essence punches holes in part of the blanket so you can see some of the background. It blends the image into the background. That's what feathering does. If we do that and then we fill the feather, it doesn't fill the edge. It blends the edge. Well, that's not always what we need because we need a firmer edge around some things in order to apply effects to blur, smudge, all kinds of things. So I use the object select and mask to cut objects out so that we can keep all the original pixel information. But I also like to then take that selection subject, select object, and save the selection as a silhouette. So we're just going to name this iguana out shape. All one word. I like to keep it all as one word. And we're going to click OK. So now we have that shape selected. So if we ever have to go back later, add a texture, do a fill, do an outer glow, do any effects to the shape, we have the shape. Here, it's a window cut out of the image where all the pixels are still there. It would work to do it similarly by double clicking on this layer and doing a color fill, right? We filled color inside of a shape before to make it a silhouette. The difference is if the image is feathered as a mask and you fill it, you're going to get a soft blend edge of the color, not a hard edge. And at times, you need to blur and glow objects, you need the hard edge. So I always like to save every single selection I do inside of the select, save selection so that I have the silhouettes of all the objects. I save the silhouettes of all the objects because it also adds a separate iguana shape under your channels, and your channels in essence is both the full RGB and the color separation, which you see in the book. So you'll notice there's the mask and the shape. Well, the mask would be feathered and the shape is hard. So they're actually two different channels. So there's times when I need just that, and there's times when I need just that. So I like to actually save it in 2 locations. Now that we painstakingly selected that, I like to do select, deselect, Command D, just so there aren't more. Anytime I do a selection of any kind, when I'm done doing what I have to do, I deselect, just so that I know I'm not manipulating anything that I don't want to manipulate while I'm thinking through what I'm doing, which also means we can turn our waterfall back on. Let's turn our waterfall back on. And now you're going to see Mr. Lizard. And I've got to crank my opacity back up to 100% so you can truly see me. But he looks pretty good already. Like you can see how clean he is around the edges. So he's pretty good as far as scale and proportion goes. So I'm going to hide him for a minute because we got to go get the rock. We got to do the same thing. I want to bring the rock. I want to get everything in here, and I'm going to show you kind of the advanced thought process for layering object selections and kind of what you can do with them. So we can close the iguana.jpg because we're done with him. I don't have to worry about the selection or anything because it's all stored inside my new Photoshop file. So if I ever needed to duplicate this layer and make it new object, new document, I could. If I ever had to disable or release the mask, I could. Everything is there. The original aspect of that image is there because I haven't scaled or anything. I didn't squish him. He's as big as he is. All right. Now, let's save this file before we get any further, and we'll just name it let's do advertising class 2.psd. Shrink this down a little bit so I have a little bit more of the screen I can see. Okay, so I need the rocks. The next thing I need is the rocks because I want to cut one rock out and put it down here somewhere so that feels like it's part of the waterfall. So let's go into Photoshop. Right, first thing we have to do is release the background because remember we want to free up the pixels. Then we're going to duplicate the layer so we can make sure the resolution matches. We want to make sure the resolution matches. So the first thing we're going to do is right click and do layer from background. And I'm just going to name it rock. So there's rock. And I actually only want this rock. And in the olden days, I would actually draw a box around this rock and I would crop it. I would actually crop the image, but you don't need to do that anymore because the object masking has gotten so good that it doesn't matter that the ocean, the clouds, everything exists in the photo because you don't see it and I might need it later. And storage has gotten much bigger and transferring files has gotten bigger. So I have to worry less about having things in a Photoshop file that I'm never going to use. And in this case, I might someday use the rocks. Okay, so let's just free it up and we'll name the layer rock. And then we're just going to duplicate the layer and we're going to bring it over to our Photoshop file. So we'll duplicate the layer and we'll bring it over to our Photoshop file. Now, the rock should be hard edges. There should be no feathering in the rock when we do this because it is a hard-edged object and it has a firm edge. Like this is a firm edge. So that should be firm when we do any kind of masking or anything inside our new image. So I'm going to close rock.jpg. I don't need it. And I have to find rock. Oh, there it is right there. So I'm going to move this down. Now you will notice the resolution on this rock is not very big because look how small that image is in relationship to the rest. So I think I'm going to have to duplicate a few rocks and stack them all up in the corner so that it looks a little bit more dominant. This resolution of this image was not as high a quality. Can I scale it up with show transform controls? Yes. Will it sacrifice resolution? Yes. Will it not look like it comes from the same place because the resolution is different? Yes. So we want to really try to not do that. So ideally, we want a really big image of a rock, but for the sake of the process, we'll use the rock we got. All right, so we need to zoom in a little bit on the rock. There it is. We're gonna move over to our marquee tool. So let's click on the marquee tool. Let's do select and mask, right? Select and mask. Let's do select object and let's see how it does. Oh, Photoshop is so smart. Yours may look a little different, remember, because of your transparency, right? I have my transparency really, so look at the difference. When it's at 27, you can see a lot of the background. When I crank transparency up to like 80, you can't see any of the background. And that is strictly so that I can see how much of the object I am getting in my selection. I like to have that thing really cranked up. Green rock. Okay, so there's rock. So zoom out a little bit because your rock actually is way up there. Let's use the move tool. Select, select. Okay. Cool. Move down towards the bottom. Very good. Good. And now let's switch to the marquee rectangular clip. Select and mask. And scroll up to the top. And okay, select subject. Give it a second. Voila. Okay. The key is remember that if we're trying to select an object, if not, we have to use the plus and scribble in that rock in order to start the selection process. We're just bypassing the start the selection process by getting it to try to figure out the object we would like to look at. It immediately picked the foreground and picked what it thought was the rock we were looking for. Make sure you turn your transparency up to like maybe 80%, just so that you don't see a lot of the background. You only see the rock that is selected. This up here makes it a lot easier because if I go to, watch if I crank it up even higher. I mean, I don't see any of the background. So I get a really good idea of how much of the rock is selected. If you go all the way to 100%, you only see the selection. Look how good that is. You can already see how well it's going to go inside of the image. So let's do Command plus. Go all the way to the top of it. So let's do the view. And just for the sake of it, let's do onions. Go back to the top. So now crank that one all the way up. There you go. So now you can really see it. So let's do Command plus and use your space bar and let's zoom in so you can see what I see. Because you're going to notice the only thing we truly have to clean up is the sand around the bottom edge of this rock. So you can see it right here on the left, and you can see it right here. A little bit over here. Yeah, there's a little bit. We need to get in and clean this up a little bit because I want it to look perfect. So I'm going to go in and I'm going to do minus. Remember, it's minus. So you got to pick the minus up the top there. Man, it does a really good job, though. This algorithm keeps getting better and better with what they can do. I mean, look how clean that is. It is so clean. It's like miraculous. This was hours of work when I was a junior designer, cleaning things up and blending them together. The algorithm has gotten so good. Like, it is like ridiculous how good it is. I mean, it knew we wanted the foreground rock. Which one? This down here? This? Yeah, I'm leaving that because that's a nook in the rock. And so I can't tell if that's part of the rock or not, but I'm actually going to stack a bunch of object masks on top of each other so that we can build like a bigger stack of rocks, because this thing is smaller than I wanted it to be, but it's still okay. It's fine. But I want the hard edge, so that's good. So I got it cleaned up the way I want it. So I'm going to zoom out a little bit, and here's my rock. And I'm going to switch to my move tool. So here it is. And I think I'm going to stack a bunch together. So I'm going to click on my rock layer here and see what I got. I'm going to duplicate layer. And I'm just going to name it rock 2. And I'm going to move it over. I'm just going to stack this thing a little bit. So there's 2. Then I'm going to duplicate layer. I'm going to name it rock 3. So you see, I'm just stacking a few rocks. I'm just trying to get a surface area for my iguana. So I just put like 3 rocks down here. It would have been nice if this rock was a little higher quality, but we got to do what we got to do. And I don't want to transform it and make it bigger because I don't want to teach you the wrong thing and have a low resolution rock in front of a high resolution iguana. So we'll just stack a couple. And you'll notice that now you have your rock layers all stacked, all with the same mask, all selected as an object, all with full detail. So now we're going to make the iguana smaller. So we're going to show transform controls, hold down Option. We're going to shrink him down. So object just scales from the center. And so I'm just scaling it from the center. So I have a place to put my little iguana on. So I'm going to scale him down. So he's roughly the right, because I got to rotate him, like he's not in the right spot. But I'm just going to kind of stick him there so we can get the basic gist of it. We're only at 8%. So this is like really, really high quality. So I'm going to move him down kind of like this. Now you can't really tell that I have multiple rocks there because I kind of have him covering the corner of the overlap. I put his fingers, that one kind of angled so it's sitting, so he feels a little more natural. And when I'm done with that, I'm just going to hit enter or return. And I'm going to turn off my transform controls. I do need to turn my waterfall, make sure my waterfall is okay. It's 100%, so that's good. And so we'll go in and do some object layering of the mask so we can dress this guy up a little bit when we get a little bit further along. But for right now, I'm just going to scale him and put him in there. And so now I got to bring my hiker in because I want to have my hiker standing here, and hopefully he's bigger because I want him to take up about this space. So you can kind of see what I'm talking about with the object layering. So we got our rocks, we got our waterfall, we got our iguana. So we're off to a good start here. So let's get in and let's find our hiker. So I'm going to drag him in. Same process we did before. We want to layer from background. So we release the layer. We're going to name it hiker. All right, so open up that image and release him. It's funny, he's dressed in cold weather gear and we're putting him in a waterfall, but hey, what do you want? He didn't plan for it. All right, so we'll release it, and then we want to duplicate our layer, and let's bring it over to our advertising class layer. Let's bring that over. Then I can close this image. And hopefully, oh, he's decent size. He's not huge, but He's decent. He's probably realistic for. And I think I'm going to flip this guy. So he's facing the other direction. So I just went up to flip canvas. See if we can flip him. Oh, wrong one. Let's do this. I'm going to do transform, flip horizontally. So there he is. He's facing the other direction now. So now we have him facing the other direction. Now we have to cut him out. So we got to do the same thing we did with the waterfall, the rock, the iguana. We got to cut this dude out. So he's there. We did edit transform. We flipped him horizontally. So now he's facing the other direction. And now we're going to go in and do the same process. So we're going to select and mask. We're going to select subject. And it should create a pretty good, so let's zoom in. Shows the checkered background. In your preview?
You don't have no, on your screen stuff, but you don't have your background there. The background, the black, you make it pretty. Share those stuff, the background.
In the select subject mode or in the regular?
That's not such a I can see my checkerboard.
Do you have high quality preview selected?
If I put my background on, you don't see it. It's just a flip. You don't have your background.
So what were you seeing before?
No, I didn't see that. Okay. If you put the background on, it looks like yours, but you don't have it.
I know, yeah. Because I changed the opacity to soften it and then I turned it back to 100%. So that's why mine looks a little bit different. The waterfall layer on top of my background layer is 100%. And I think yours is 80% or something like that. So that's why you see a little bit of the checkerboard. Okay, all right. So we got to go in and clean this thing up a little bit. Although it looks really, really close. I'm trying to see, is that white spot between his glove? The image, let's go to subtract. Let me make the brush a little bit smaller. Yeah, the white between his glove right here is a little bit of the background. So I just made my brush a little bit smaller, like size 4, just to get in there. But it's hard to tell because the waterfall. So the backpack looks good. Man, this did a really good job. The strap of the backpack doesn't have a hole in it. So right here. I'm just going to clean this up a little bit. It doesn't matter the level of the client. I really try to be uber detail oriented with these objects. Actually, there's a couple of spots on the strap. Yeah. A lot of designers cheat and they just make sure they find the subject matter. Like they would find a hiker on the beach or something so that they would get a consistent application, but that's part of the fun. maybe not a guy in Frozen world, but I like to make things kind of surreal. So bringing things from environments that maybe don't necessarily belong together. There's big business in photo blending. But the algorithm does keep getting better and better. I mean, Photoshop has gotten really good at object selection, which they now call subject selection, but it used to be object selection. Nature of the upgrade. In most cases, the printed eye wouldn't see a lot of this. Once I have him decent, I'm gonna go in and click OK. Remember, if you see something you don't like, you know, always double click and go back in and see if there's anything. We gotta have see a spot. Yep. Or like if I do that and I don't like it, I'll just go back to plus and tap on this area. I need to make my brush bigger. Sometimes it's easier just to add it back. That's the beauty about the mask. You're erasing it, but you're not really erasing it, because if I disable it, you can see everything is still there. All right, so we have our objects in here now. So let's go in and do some layering of our object mask, just so that you can see what different things you can do. So we're going to go in and let's go ahead and lock our rock layers, just so that we don't move them, we don't touch them. Right now we can lock our hiker too. So we have just our iguana. So here he is. And I'm going to go in and let's go in and duplicate the iguana. So we're going to make iguana, and I'm going to name it iguana overlay. So iguana overlay. The reason I'm naming it iguana overlay, and you can see, I mean, it's the exact same iguana. He's right on top of the other one. Let's go into the filters and let's add some pixels or some noise to him. What do we want to do? Do we want to do pointillist? Do we want to, just so that you could see the technique. So let's go in and let's do crystallize, just so that you can see some things that are going to happen here. So we're going to pick crystallize, and you're going to get something that kind of looks a little bit like this. And if we crank the cell size down, you obviously get less. And so let's make it like about 6. So let's make it 6. And let's click OK. And you're going to notice that he gets this pattern on his face. And so I can turn it on and turn it off so you can see what's going on. And what we're going to do is we're actually going to remove, like we did last week, using our feather brush, which is our little eraser brush right here. We're going to make the size of the brush about, I don't know, 350 or so, roughly in the 350 range. And we're going to make the hardness, have it a soft hardness, so like 11%. Yep, so we're in the eraser tool, and then we're up here in our brush settings of the eraser tool, and we're just making the size about 350 or so, and we want to make it a soft blend, so we want to make it like 11% or so. And so once we do that, we're going to only keep the tile to this arm and belly. So you see this arm and belly right here? We're going to erase the effect on every part of the iguana except for that arm and that belly. So I'm just removing it all. And you'll be able to tell, because when you click your eyeball, you should see his arm and belly have texture to them. So I've added, in essence, a mosaic tile pattern to just this arm and just this belly. And if I hide it, you can see it's all detailed. When I turn it back on, you can see it's pixelated. So I'm going to go back to the iguana layer and I'm going to duplicate it again. And this time I'm going to name it Iguana Shine. So we have iguana overlay, we have regular iguana, and we have iguana shine. And we'll go up to the filter. All right, you're fine. And let's just change the brightness or the saturation of the shine one. So let's just crank it up a little bit. So let's see, maybe vibrance. Might be a little too much. I'm just going to crank it down a little bit. So I'm just overly saturating his face. And I'm going to click OK. And so you should see the difference of the vibrant color versus the standard iguana. That's what we started with. That's the texture that we added to his arm. And this is the vibrant color we're adding to his arm. So I'm going to go in now, and with my eraser tool, I'm going to remove it from his arms and his neck and his belly, and I'm going to leave just his face. And you'll be able to see it when I turn it off and turn it on. So you should notice that his face is like extra saturated now, extra bright. And now let's do that again and do duplicate layer and do iguana texture. But this time I'm going to put iguana texture on the top, and I'm going to do a filter. Let's do dust and scratches. Oh, a little too much. I'm gonna do like maybe 3 point or so. Crank up the threshold level just a skosh. I think I got to go down to about 2 or 3. So let's go to like 3. And then I'm going to multiply the 3. And I'm going to change the opacity and crank it down a little bit. And what it's going to do is it's going to add a speckle to the iguana and enhance his color separation. Your book has you do an outline over the models and do a multiply, and it creates a line art around the photo. I actually like to do it with images because it enhances the contrast of the image. As long as you don't go crazy, like as long as you keep your opacity at a reasonable amount, you can really enhance the texture of your image, which you can see right there. Gives a little extra color separation. If I move it below his overlay, you'll see the arm stays enhanced. So see how the arm is enhanced? If I move it under the shine, you're going to notice his head stays brighter. So now I've sandwiched separation, which you can see in his tail and his back and his belly, with the head that's now brighter, and the arm that's texturized. Now, let's take that one step further and let's add a new layer under the iguana. So there's the new layer under the iguana. And I'm going to name this iguana silo for silhouette. I'm going to do select load selection. So select load selection, iguana shape. And I'm going to where is my selection? Should get my marching ants here. So where is my, do I have my ants turned off? Let me just see something here. So let's hide it. It's there. So why, where did it go? Oh, it was when he was big. Ah! Ixnay on the ombre. Let's get rid of that. So we're going to trash that. I've got to load my selection with him smaller. He's all the way up there. So now, that'll throw us for a little loop, huh? So let's do this. Let's add selection. Let's save our selection. Iguana small silo. So there we are. Let's add a new layer. I'm going to move it under here. We're going to name this iguana silo small. We're going to fill it in white. Now, I don't know if you noticed that, but if I turn that off, it adds a very subtle outline. Now, I didn't want to do that because I actually want to do this. So let's just do a soft blur. And then we're going to add a slight bit of that. Slight bit of that. And I'm going to click OK. And I'm actually going to remove the blur and have just a little bit of his head highlighted. So there is my iguana. He's got a little detail to him. So now let's go to the hiker and let's duplicate the layer and click OK. And let's do image adjust brightness contrast. He's pretty contrasty, so his pants and stuff don't get a lot more. So let's not do that. Let's do image adjust just for the sake of the process, just so that you can see it. I don't want to invert. Let's do posterizing a little bit. Let's see if it affects his pants at all. He's tricky because he's so high contrasty. So let's do Let's do. Let's see if we can. Oh yeah, yeah. Let's see if we can. Let's do color balance. Sometimes it's nice to. A little bit of that. I'm going to. Take the blue out of his backpack. And then let's duplicate this layer again. And let's go in and unlock that. Image adjust. Let's do levels. And we'll adjust the levels a little bit. Just for a sweatshirt. Click OK. We're going to go in and just affect his sweatshirt. So now just his sweatshirt is highlighted. And one more time. So we'll do hiker shirt. And this is hiker jeans. We'll duplicate it one more time. And we'll call it hiker backpack. Unlock that. We'll do image adjust. And let's do, let's see what we have here. So we have jeans, and sweatshirt. Starting to look a little bit better. And let's do, well, we're on his backpack. So what do we have to do here? We have to do, let's lighten up the exposure on his backpack so we get a little more detail. Let's make this 0. Here we go. Okay. I'm gonna get in here and remove everything but his backpack. That's pretty good, actually. Because now we have shirt, jeans, and backpack. Now he's looking good. In theory, we could select these all together and blow this thing up, or we could merge this thing, but I tend to keep them separate in case I ever have to go back and adjust them at any point in time. But we could scale this thing up if we had the pixels, but I think he's going to become kind of pixelated because the resolution, ideally I would have liked him to have been about that big, but for the sake of the process, we'll just blow him up a little bit. Now you can see all of his parts. He started there. We added his backpack. That really helped his backpack. Now you can actually see the details in his backpack. Shirt, enhance that a little bit. And jeans, make them blue. So now he's good. So let's see here. I wish the iguana. I wish the iguana was a little better detail. Then we could have blown him up. Now he looks as big as the dude. Big iguana. Say that again. I know, he's huge now. So now with our overlay, which you're right, I had my background one kind of hidden or turned off. I probably would go in here and make a duplicate of this layer. And you'll see this a lot of time in advertising to control where you put the typography. Duplicate this layer, make this like, I don't know, 80% or so. So you can see that we're softening it. Let's crank it down even a little bit more. Like that. And then turn this on to 100%. And I'm just going to create a controlled halo so that I can use it for typography. So this can even be darker. So darken that, get in here and darken this a little bit. And then I'm a micromanager when it comes to imagery. So I would consider maybe even duplicating the 100% layer and make this highlight. So this is waterfall 100, which means 100%. Waterfall halo, which means kind of that thing I got going on. And then I would go in here and do image adjust, brightness, contrast. And I'm going to crank up this water. You can see it right there. And so watch what happens. And so now that water is nice and bright. So we learned the shape clips. We learned, draw a rectangle, cut a picture out of it as a clipping mask. This object selection or subject selection and mask is a really good way to go because you can see the replication of the clip to adjust the object. You can see that the pixel density is there. So if we ever needed, we could always go back, but you could see I actually removed the pixels from the manipulated one. So the one that wasn't manipulated is this one. And that has all of the background sky still. And so sometimes I'll go in and the ones that I manipulated, which are these, I'll merge them together because they're still a mask, but I combine the backpack, the jeans, and the shirt all into one. So I don't have so many layers, like the 3 rock layers. I probably don't need 3 rock layers because you can see the iguana sitting on top of him. But this is a really good way of object selecting, object cropping, object clipping, object blending into an image. And I guess the last little part of this process would be his hair, because he has a little bit of a wispiness to his hair. So if we were to go in and take the original hiker and duplicate the layer to hiker blend, which is what your book does, and we move that layer to the top, which you'll notice it then hides the other things. We could go in here and we could double click and we could feather the image. So I'm going to turn on the feathering, and you can actually see that this thing is starting to get some pixel separation. And so let's do edge detection. We're going to crank that up just a skosh. And we're going to move the shift edge to the inside of the object is what we're doing. So I'm doing a feather to the edge but I'm doing it to the inside edge. That's why you're starting to see that little bit of blue. So I'm going to click OK just so you can see. And I'm going to hide these other ones. So you see how that feather caused him. So let's go back in just so you can see the difference. So if I go in and let's make sure that I'm on the right area here. So let's clear selection and let's go in to select subject. So there he is. And let's just adjust the feather so it isn't, it's hard to tell when it's not a drastic thing. So let's shift the edge a little bit. Just a skosh. His edge is actually blended right here. And that's what you do with the models is you feather their hair. So if I really crank it up, you can really see the feather there, but you don't want to go too crazy, like it starts to eat into the entire guy. So I try to stay in the 3 pixel to 5 pixel range, somewhere in there. So you can see, and I always shift the edge inside to about a negative 10% shift edge. That way it's on the inside of the hair, not the outside of the hair. And you can see that his hair is starting to pull into the background. Now, what I would do then is I'm going to turn all these other ones on just so you can see. Get him back to the way he was. I would go in here and I would soften his body a little bit. Let's go in here. Let's get into our blend. Let's make our brush a little bit smaller. That's good. And so now I could only have his head be the blend. So you can see, I can pull all his sweatshirt back out. Make the brush a little bigger, make my life a little bit easier. So there's his backpack. Highlight his jeans a little bit again, bring that blue back out. And so now his head is feathered. There he is. A little bit of softness. You can see the top of his head. And so that's the trick, is that feather edge for the head, getting the image blending in. I'm going to save this. So now let's add one more object, just so that you can get comfortable doing it on your own. So what do we need here? A bird or something? Why don't you go out to Pexels and get an eagle, or I'm trying to think of what we can add to a butterfly, maybe. Bring it in, release it from background, add it to a layer in this file, and then I want to see you do an object mask so we can make sure that we got the gist of this thing.